What is the fundamental difference between doing a dumbbell press and doing a barbell press? Because they look really similar, and in fact they can look identical, but they're quite different. And the difference comes down to one main thing, which is really just the amount of constraints that we're dealing with in the motion. Okay, so let's just imagine that we're looking at someone from above, right? So head, shoulders, elbows, right? So this is me and you're looking at me from top down, right? Or if someone's lying on a bench, you're sort of squatting down looking at them. Let's imagine sort of what this circumstance in a dumbbell press looks like. Well, if I have two dumbbells in my hands, right, they're obviously separate and they're free moving, which means that at any given point, they can fall forward, they can fall backward, they can fall left, they can fall right, they can fall anywhere in between all those different points. And so what that creates is a difference in terms of how we have to manage that motion. And oftentimes people oversimplify this by saying, oh, there's a stability demand. It's like, yeah, but really, why do we care about that? What impact does that have on muscular development and what muscles we're actually taxing? So think about it this way. Whenever you're performing a press with dumbbells, you need to make sure pretty much that your forearm segment is directly underneath of the weight, right? Because if your forearm isn't under the dumbbell, the dumbbell's gonna fall in one direction or another if you're using a challenging load, right? And so in essence, there always has to be some kind of relationship where the dumbbell pretty much has to be stacked at least over top of the elbow or slightly inside the elbow, right? It can't really be outside the elbow unless you're intentionally doing something like, you know, a fly, but we're just gonna assume that we're using heavy weights and we're doing a press, right? So what does that actually mean? Well, imagine this. If, let's say, your triceps were to contract super hard in this position, right? Your triceps sit on this side of the joint. What they're gonna do is they're gonna pull the forearm outward, right? So what would happen if the triceps contracted just a little bit too hard, right? Like for whatever reason, if someone could just command your triceps to contract 3 times as hard as your pecs and your delts, what would happen? Well, the dumbbells would fall toward either side. And so what this creates is a little bit of a management situation in the elbow as compared to the shoulder. Well, let's say, I don't even know really where the shoulder joint, let's just say the shoulder joint is like somewhere here, okay? And your pecs are sort of running this way, your delts are running this way. The muscles that control the shoulder are gonna have to be the prime movers of this exercise, i.e. your pecs and your delts. And the amount of triceps recruitment, unless you're intentionally trying to do some kind of triceps press, is gonna be quite limited, right? Because again, if the triceps contract too hard, the dumbbells are just gonna move away from you, okay? So that's sort of fundamentally what a dumbbell press is biasing, is just shoulder stuff. Now, again, of course, you can manipulate a dumbbell press such that you're making it more triceps dominant, but again, if we're just pressing heavy weights, that's gonna be the reality. And so oftentimes people will be confused because they're like, oh, you know, I can bench press 200 pounds for 10 reps. Why is it that when I grab dumbbells, I can't just grab the hundreds and bang the same thing out? Well, that comes down to what I mentioned earlier, which is this concept of constraints, okay? So imagine now, instead of holding 2 dumbbells, we're just holding 1 barbell, right? So it's stretching all the way across, weights over here, right? Again, looks very visually similar, but what does the barbell allow for that the dumbbells does not allow for? If I'm pressing dumbbells, again, I have to manage that forearm thing. If I'm pressing a barbell, all I really have to manage is the direction of the barbell this way and this way. In other words, I don't want the barbell to fall this way and I don't want it to fall this way. But inward and outward, my hands are constrained. My hands can't move, or at least hopefully they don't move around and slide. And so what in essence that allows for is much more contribution, again, assuming the same technique, from the triceps muscles. So how does that actually work? Well, there's this thing, and it's called friction. And friction, basically in simple terms, is a force that allows your hands to stick to things when they otherwise might slide. So imagine if the barbell, instead of being a barbell, was just made of ice, your hands would be slipping all over the place, right? But the reason that a barbell has that knurling, that rough thing, is so that when you grab it, your hands don't slide left and right. And so when you're actually pressing into the bar, that elbow extension, the triceps action, is still happening, but now because you're within the constraints of the bar, that elbow extension actually just gets turned into force directly into the bar. So just a really oversimplified way of describing this would be, you know, imagine again that when the triceps contract, they pull the forearm this way. Instead of the hand just going outward this way, because it's constrained, what ends up happening is motion of this segment right here, you can imagine the elbow, if it were straightening, would sort of pry itself like this, right? It gets essentially forced and redistributed or repurposed into force of the bar or motion of the bar moving upward. And so the actual force of a barbell press, because of this whole friction thing, part of the force, yeah, is just going straight downward through the, through the wherever on the upper arm via the hands. But if we're thinking about, okay, what happens if my triceps extend? Well, my hands would want to slide outward. So what that means is that the friction of the bar is actually pushing my hands inward. So there's a little bit of a force going this way, and there's a little bit of a force going this way. And what that ultimately ends up looking like is a force direction that's kind of actually more like this. Right? So the apparent direction of force of a barbell press is straight down, but taking into account the friction, what's happening is the force direction is actually redirecting somewhere more in the middle of the shoulder. And if you know anything about this thing that we call torque and moment arm, basically what that allows for is force to be traversed through the elbow and then also through the shoulder. In other words, you are dividing the force within each hand between the elbow and the shoulder, whereas with the dumbbell, if I just imagine this is now a dumbbell over here, okay, that force of the dumbbell pretty much has to fall mostly like that, right? Because if it falls too far on either side, I'm just turning it into an elbow exercise, and if I'm pressing any kind of heavy weight, again, for the reasons we described earlier, we kind of have to stay underneath. So in essence, what happens is all of that force, again, I'm just assuming this is the shoulder, not this old one that I drew, all of the force pretty much has to fall directly to the shoulder, wherever the shoulder happens to be, and a very small amount of force falls to the elbow. So in essence, per unit of me pushing, the dumbbell press ends up being much more shoulder, again, assuming the same technique, whereas the barbell press ends up being a sort of blend of shoulder and elbow. And that's, in my opinion, one of the main reasons why we can generally press more weight on a barbell, more combined weight on a barbell, because we're splitting up the force within either side of the body in a little bit more of a distributed way. So you might ask, well, does that mean that the barbell press is better or the dumbbell press is better? Well, it just depends on what you're trying to do, right? If you are coaching a beginner client who has never, lifted before, and if you've put a pair of dumbbells in their hands, it's going to be kind of weird for them to coordinate, right? They're basically giving themselves a lower opportunity to actually be able to stabilize the load with more stuff. But when you constrain the hands to a barbell and you fix the hands to a barbell, the motion automatically becomes a little bit more stable because, again, you really only have to manage that upward to downward direction because you can sort of, like a car jack would, you can crank it up with your triceps and your shoulders simultaneously. So you give that person more stuff to basically coordinate the motion, in addition to the fact that your hands can't move on the bar, makes it more stable and it distributes the load more. And so especially for a beginner, that might be a great option because they, even though relatively speaking, they'll probably end up having more stress on the shoulder as compared to the elbow, stress just being tension of those muscles that control those joints. This could be enough of a stimulus for both of those things where you see a great amount of growth. The more advanced that you get, perhaps, you start to be able to press so much weight that it ends up just being unmanageable from a stress and a fatigue perspective, right? So that's where potentially a dumbbell press could come into play where you might say, okay, I want an exercise that's more specific to the shoulder and a little bit less specific to the elbow. This a kind of press that will load the elbow proportionately less, maybe because, tomorrow I'm training triceps or the day before I'm training triceps. Whatever it happens to be, there are a ton of different applications for both of these. So it's not that the barbell is better than the dumbbell or vice versa. It's simply that they do different things and their differences ultimately come down to the amount of constraint that is within each of these motions. Now, I'm sure there are many other aspects to both of these that make them distinct, and there are other caveats to this conversation that can sort of add layers to this conversation. But overall, this is the primary difference. And I think that in application, this is enough information to kind of make a decision about, okay, do I go with the barbell or do I go with the dumbbells?